Thank you very much, Michal, and thank you very much, Joe, for the invitation to speak to you all this evening. I'm going to talk to you this evening about ecological Armageddon and biological oblivion, a great cheeries after-dinner subject. It used to be the case that you needed a science fiction mentality to imagine a world where all life on Earth had been extinguished. It has been the theme of novels such as Cormac McCarthy's The Road and Disney's Wall-E, which imagined a robot desperately trying to keep a potted plant alive while humans had escaped the moribund planet altogether. In Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, the dystopia involved people huddled on a dead planet searching for meaning after all ecosystems collapsed in 2049. If this scenario seems far-fetched, it is only in the timescale. Scientists now predict that on our current course, the planet will have entered a phase never before experienced in human history by 2030, a little over 10 years from now. And actually, before I came down to speak today, I saw on the internet an article from the BBC which a quote from the head of the Potsdam Climate Institute said that action is required within the next 18 months. It looks like we don't even have the next 10 years to figure out what to do. This is no longer science fiction. Very real headlines now predict the most dire outcomes. Scientists, and I'm quoting, scientists warn of ecological Armageddon after a study shows flying insect numbers plummeting by 75%, warned the London Independent newspaper in 2017. While in early 2018, The Guardian published a story entitled, "Europe Faces Biodiversity Oblivion After the Collapse in French Birds." Later that year, the World Wildlife Fund released its biennial report highlighting how wildlife populations, from mammals, birds, fish, reptiles and amphibians, have collapsed by 60% since the 1970s. In May of this year, the UN's Intergovernmental and Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services revealed that an eye-watering 1 million species face extinction by mid-century. It certainly sounds like the end of days, and if you're not a little bit scared like this, then you haven't been keeping up. And that's before we factor in the horrors which await from the breakdown of our climate. I want to talk to you this evening about what happens when ecosystems collapse, particularly right here in Ireland. What does it mean, and why does it matter? What can we do about it? Can we rebuild ecosystems so that they can be rich and resilient again? Despite the stark headlines, the collapse of an ecosystem does not mean the death of all life. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is one of the leading world bodies in species assessments, defines ecosystem collapse as a transformation of identity, the loss of defining features and or the replacement by a different or novel ecosystem. As examples, we can talk about how the marine ecosystem off the coast of Newfoundland in Canada collapsed in the 1990s when its once abundant cod fishery disappeared, devastating local communities. Or there's the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, once the fourth largest inland water body in the world, but which is now less than 10% of its original size. Its once unique plant and animal life have vanished, along with the ancient human heritage which lined its shores. But the region is not dead. The ecosystem is much simpler, and from a human perspective, it no longer sustains the variety of food and materials which supported people and their culture for millennia. In Ireland, many people still look out on our landscape and see a green and unspoiled country. But what has really happened since the arrival of people? Assuming people first arrived in Ireland around 9,000 years ago, the answer is, for the first 4,000 to 5,000 years anyway, not very much. With farming, about 5,000 years ago, came the transformation of the oak forests to open grassland. This coincided with the extinction of species such as bears, wildcats, and lynx. The forest ecosystem, in effect, collapsed, so that today our native woodlands cover only about 1 to 2% of the land, and where they are found, they are tiny and isolated fragments. Ireland is one of the most deforested countries in the world. But the farmland which replaced them was quite rich in nature. It supported a great diversity of birds, insects, and plants. The hedgerows acted as surrogate woodlands, supporting many woodland animals. We even had wolves living alongside people up to the late 1700s. Until the 1900s, pollution of waterways was unheard of, and mostly rivers flowed their natural courses, meandering in the lowlands and spilling into the floodplains in winter. They were full of fish. Peatlands cover 20% of our land, and up until the turn of the 19th century, this included the great raised bogs of the Midlands, home to curlews, bittern, and cranes. At this time, our seas really did teem with fish. There were vast oyster beds down the length of the Irish Sea and nearly every inlet and bay along the west coast. Men in rowboats filled their nets with herring and mackerel within sight of the shore. But in the last 200 years, all this has changed. Wetlands were drained and reclaimed for agriculture. Drainage of fields, the arrival of artificial fertilizers and pesticides, and the reseeding of flower-rich meadows with monocultures of ryegrass transformed the farming landscape into one with few wildflowers, insects, or ground-nesting birds. Much of the fertilizers simply washed off the land into waterways, joining malfunctioning septic tanks and sewage outfalls, so that today half of our rivers are polluted. Since only the 1980s, the number of pristine water bodies has plummeted from over 500 to 21 today. With the passing of the Arterial Drainage Act in 1945, the state embarked on a programme of physically altering 11,500 kilometres of rivers to make them straighter and deeper, permanently altering how they function. Dams on our great rivers, among them the Shannon, the Erne, the Lee, block the migrations of fish like the Atlantic salmon, which are now unable to reach their ancient spawning grounds on these rivers. With the founding of Bordnamona in the 1950s, the raised bogs were industrially exploited to such an extent that today the official figure for active bog, that is where the peat is still accumulating, is 0.6% of its original extent. The planting of conifer plantations on peat soils, typically in the uplands, along with overgrazing by sheep, turf cutting and wildfires, have left only 20% of these Atlantic bog habitats, synonymous with uplands in the west of Ireland, worthy of conservation. Meanwhile, at sea, the introduction of steam trawling in the late 1800s, dragging a weighted net across the bottom of the ocean floor, transformed our seas, destroying complex habitats and dumping vast quantities of sea life overboard, something which is known as discarding. So that today the inshore fishing fleet can no longer make a living from fish, while giant factory trawlers far offshore sieve the sea with nets the size of football pitches. Together, these pressures have resulted in the recorded extinction of over 120 species of plant and animals from Ireland, while scientific assessments today, from bees and butterflies to birds and sharks, tell us that a third of all species are threatened with extinction or near threatened. The transformation has been so complete that all of the ecosystems in Ireland, across the land and the sea, have collapsed. Not unlike the peoples of the Aral Sea, we have been left in this country with a much simplified natural environment, which has resulted in the loss of heritage and livelihoods. In the last 10 years, the transformation has accelerated. Agricultural expansion plans have increased pollution with greater emissions of greenhouse gases and ammonia, runoff of fertilizers and slurry, and the clearance of habitats. Plantations of conifer monocultures swallow small farms and have helped drive birds like the curlew to the precipice of extinction. In our oceans, Ireland continues to be identified as one of the worst offenders for overfishing in the European Union. The response from government and industry has been a wave of greenwashing, modifying not their behaviour but their public relations, telling us that Ireland's landscape is wild and that our agriculture is green and sustainable. Funding for the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which is the chief agency responsible for the conservation of biodiversity, was slashed during the recession, and currently stands at around €13 million per annum, less than what we give to the Greyhound Racing Fund, and a third of what we give to On Board Bia to market Irish food as Origin Green. Origin Green, in my view, is a fraud. If this is something that has gone largely unnoticed by Irish people, it is because we are now exporting much of our ecological footprint. The abundance which we all enjoy relies on a pattern of consumption which itself relies on collapsing ecosystems across the planet, from tropical forests to the open oceans to the very climate itself. According to studies, Ireland has broken through nearly all of the planetary limits which define a safe living space, including our ecological footprint, emissions of greenhouse gases, the use of materials, and the production of key nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen. And yet, embracing nature, bringing wildlife back to our towns, our farms, hills and seas is not only possible and a worthy goal of itself, but also is likely to be the cheapest, most effective, most popular way of reversing rural decline and meeting our climate change targets. The Farming for Nature programme in the Burren shows us how we can produce food at low intensity while protecting farmers' incomes, heritage, watercourses and biodiversity. The Lochbura parklands in County Offaly shows us what the worked-out bogs of the Midlands could look like were we to re-wet them and rewild all of our peatlands. Trees are by far the most effective carbon capture and storage technology known, and we can create large native woodlands across our uplands and along restored river corridors. Across Europe, large dams are coming down, allowing rivers to run free, bringing back fish and restoring floodplains. Creating large, effective marine protected areas are proven to increase the populations of fish and other marine life, which spill over into areas where they increase catches for small-scale, low-impact fishing communities. We have to end bottom trawling and allow seafloor habitats to recover. We have to stop haggling with the science on fish quotas and end overfishing once and for all. We need to move away from conifer plantations to a forestry model that works with nature, ending the use of pesticides and the clear felling of trees. We need to convert plantations in uplands and on peat soil to native woodlands or restore functioning bogs. We need to end the fantasy of continued growth in agriculture to service global commodity markets and move to a more diverse system of food production based on regenerative farming, organic or other techniques which are sympathetic to soil, water and nature. We need to give large areas of land and sea over to nature and natural processes and start reintroducing species we have driven to extinction, including large predators, so that we can have ecosystems that function once again. Above all, we need to treat the natural environment with the same level of seriousness as we do health, education and transport. We need a properly funded, independent nature conservation agency which can lead in education, conservation management and take enforcement action, just like the EPA does today. We need for the issues of climate breakdown and mass extinction to be woven into all education programs in all subjects, while we need a public awareness program so that people can be informed and engaged. Ultimately, we need a new relationship with nature, built on the recognition that there are limits to our actions and that nature has rights. I believe this should be enshrined in our Constitution. I welcome the declaration of a climate and biodiversity emergency by the Dáil earlier this year, but this is just the first baby step. The next useful step, which was passed by the Dáil at the same time, is to set up a citizens' assembly to examine the issue of biodiversity loss. Most of the solutions are already at hand, but time is not on our side. The clock is counting down. Thank you very much.